All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. Today we have with us two speakers who are going to present the most updated monitoring results for the Whistling Warbler, an endemic and endangered species in St. Vincent. And with us today, we have Lisa Sorensen, who's the Executive Director of Birds Caribbean and an adjunct associate professor at Boston University. She's an ornithologist and conservation ecologist and has 40 years of experience leading research, education, and conservation initiatives across the Caribbean. At Birds Caribbean, she collaborates with our wonderful network of partners throughout the region on programs that advance science, build local capacity, raise awareness, and protect birds and their habitats. And then we also have with us today Mike Akresh, who's a professor at Antioch University, where he conducts research with students and other collaborators on wildlife and birds in Eastern North America and in the Caribbean. In addition to his Whistling Warbler research, he has assisted with Landbird monitoring and statistical analyses with Birds Caribbean. So thank you so much, Lisa and Mike, for being here. And please take it away.
Okay, great. Thank you, Maya. So yes, thank you everybody for joining us on this webinar. It's a pre-workshop webinar. We're actually going to be in St. Vincent next week doing a conservation action plan workshop for the Whistling Warbler and the St. Vincent Amazon parrot. So we wanted to provide some background information for the workshop, and we decided to open it up to everybody so everybody could catch up on the latest news with the warbler and the parrot and what we've been up to for the last few years. So I wanted to share with you kind of the origin story for this project. I know many of you are familiar with us and our work and what's happening in the Eastern Caribbean when the volcano erupted and so forth, but there may be other new folks joining in or watching this webinar later that don't know the story of St. Vincent and the volcano. And so I'm going to talk about that a little bit, give a brief overview. I'm also going to give a brief overview of the history and describe the partners that are participating in this project, and talk about how we're building capacity for monitoring and education, and also the outreach and education work on the Whistling Warbler and St. Vincent Amazon and other forest birds. And in this work, we're working closely with our two main local partners in St. Vincent, the Forestry Department and Science, which is a local NGO. And so they've been key to this work. We also have a number of international partners, including folks like Rare Species Conservatory Foundation, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and Florida International University. So after I finish my introduction and orientation to the project, then Mike's going to take over and talk about the Whistling Warbler and the monitoring work that we've been doing, including the objectives, the methods, the results to date, discussion, and field work. All right. So just to orient you, this is the West Indies, Greater Antilles here, Lesser Antilles down here, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. The red arrow is pointing to this small volcanic island composed of one main island of St. Vincent, and then there's the Grenadine Islands, which stretch south towards Grenada. St. Vincent is a stunningly beautiful island. It's a fantastic place, of course, to see the endemic St. Vincent Amazon and other birds. It's volcanic, it's very lush and green. Here's just a few shots of some of the different areas. The Mesopotamia Valley. There's mountainous forest, but then also some agriculture taking place. You can see in the lower right photo, a farm field in the Montreal area with mountainous forest habitat in the background, which is where whistling warblers and other wildlife live. St. Vincent is a fantastic place for birding and ecotourism. There are many trails in their national parks and forests. They have waterfalls, streams, stunning views, and lots of interesting wildlife. And these are some of the endemic birds that occur in St. Vincent. There's 3 birds that are endemic only to St. Vincent. And this includes the Whistling Warbler and the St. Vincent Amazon, and then also the St. Vincent Wren, which was newly designated as a endemic species, a distinct species from the house wren in St. Vincent in 2024, when the house wren was split into 6 different species. Dominico got its own wren, the Kalinago wren, Grenada got its own wren, and so forth. So that was very exciting. It's always nice to get new endemics to add to our list of 185 endemics in the West Indies. The Grenada flycatcher is also endemic to St. Vincent and also Grenada, so it's an endemic just shared between 2 different islands. The other very special birds that you can see, beautiful regional endemics, include the Antillean crested hummingbird, the brown trembler, the purple-throated caribe, the lesser Antillean euphonia, the rufous-throated solitaire, and the lesser Antillean tanager. Those are only found in a few islands in the Eastern Caribbean. And just to note that the euphonia and the rufous-throated solitaire are extremely rare, and so our work looking for the warbler and the parrot is also helping us to find out more about where these species are located, so we can be sure to conserve the habitats that they're using. All right, so in April 2021, La Soufriere volcano erupted for the first time in 42 years on April 19th. April 9th, I'm sorry, at 8:41 a.m. In the following days, there were additional and more explosive eruptions. Eventually, the volcano's dome collapsed, and the pyroclastic flows and heavy ashfall decimated villages, farms, and housing all around the volcano. And you can see here the volcano hazard areas. Soufriere is located on the north side of the island. This was the area that was most severely impacted, called the red zone, and very high hazard area, and then increasingly lower hazard areas as you moved away from the volcano. But the mountainous forested habitat is in the central part of the island, like this, and this is where both the whistling warbler and the St. Vincent parrot and all the forest landbirds live. So this is what the eruption looked like and some of the aftermath. The eruptions also decimated ecosystems, leaving many species without homes and unable to forage in the wild, unable to find food. St. Vincent's wildlife, as you can imagine, especially the landbird species like the threatened parrot and whistling warbler, faced grave peril. I think similar to severe hurricanes, many forest birds were probably killed outright, while others died in the days and weeks afterwards since they would have had difficulty finding food and cover. And indeed, we had reports for many months afterward from our partners, walking the trails, that the forests were just absolutely silent. You heard no birds. So there were definitely impacts on the wildlife from the eruptions. Of course, it was very hard to document how many birds died, finding dead birds and so forth. But a few birds were brought in that had been injured. And for example, this parrot here on the left was found in a weakened state. Its eyes were crusted over with ash and its crop was empty. The forestry department did all they could to save it, but unfortunately it didn't make it. And then in other islands where there was a lot of ashfall and birds were probably trying to escape the hurricane, but were still impacted. For example, on Union Island, which is quite a bit further south, one of the Grenadines Islands, Radio Grenadines documented the scaly Nape pigeon dead on the ground. They said it just fell out of the sky after the eruption, so it was probably impacted by inhaling all the ash. So the plight of the birds in the forest was, of course, of major concern, given the heavy ashfall that would have affected food availability for these species. So the conservation community swiftly formed an emergency group, and we raised funds and provided much needed assistance to the forestry department working on the ground in St. Vincent. Recovery and relief supplies were sent in a shipment to the St. Vincent Forestry Department, and this included field equipment, supplies to care for rescued parrots, and hardware for repairs and to enhance the St. Vincent parrot aviary. We had many, many generous donations and support that enabled us to send several rounds of donations with field equipment for forestry. So in the weeks and months that followed, the forestry department staff spent many months doing assessments, clearing trails, repairing damage to infrastructure, and clearing waterways and so forth. Just some more images here of some of the devastated areas. And here you can see the message here is that thankfully nature is resilient. The St. Vincent and the Grenadines Forestry Director at that time, Fitzgerald Providence, recently visited an area impacted from the volcanic eruptions, and he shared some of his photos on how the vegetation is growing back in the shade of La Soufriere. And he stated in his post on Facebook, the process of regeneration is evident along the eastern slope of La Soufriere. What was described as destruction by some shows evidence of how our island became a land so beautiful. He noted, however, that the western slope was hardest hit, the lee side, and this is where the pyroclastic flows happened. All right, so what were our follow-up activities following this fundraising? Well, of course, we wanted to assess how the warbler and the parrot were doing and how were the island's land birds impacted by the volcano. As the forest regenerated, there was, of course, much work to be done with assessments, and then also a historic lack of research and funding, we realized, meant that there was very limited baseline knowledge about the ecology and population status for most of the forest birds on the island. So in partnership with several other international organizations and of course forestry and science, we developed proposals and submitted them for funding support from the Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund and also the United Nations Development Program. And thanks to funding success from these programs, we were able to launch a program to build capacity and provide the data needed for long-term landbird species protection, as well as develop a conservation plan for both the warbler and the parrot. So one of the first activities that we did was a Landbird Monitoring Training Workshop, and this took place in January 2023. It was a 5-day training workshop. We had 24 Caribbean wildlife professionals attend the workshop. Most were from St. Vincent, but we also had a few from Montserrat and St. Lucia. And our partners were trained in how to use the PROALAS Landbird Monitoring Protocol. And this is a protocol that was developed in Latin America to survey birds in tropical habitats. And we've found that it's been really, really effective. And so we've adopted it for the Caribbean region. And we've been doing a number of training workshops on how to use this protocol. And some on this call will have attended one of those workshops. And so we adapted the manual. This is available for download on our website. And a number of our partners have gotten small grants and they're doing their monitoring program now. And so we'll have lots of data from other partners to share. So in the workshop, we had sessions in the classroom on bird ID, monitoring theory, and methodology. And then we also had plenty of time in the field to practice doing PROALAS counts. And all the data were recorded on the eBird mobile app, which is set up to record PROALAS surveys. And Mike is going to talk to you in much more detail about the methodology of these surveys. And this is just a group shot to share with you the facilitators and the participants that were at the workshop. And then finally, just to touch a little bit on outreach and education, we have fantastic partners for this, of course, with science and the forestry department. We developed some new materials. We have an endemic birds of the West Indies coloring book. We also developed a bunch of stickers that could be used for outreach events like the Caribbean Endemic Bird Festival. These are stickers of the parrot and the warbler and other lesser Antillean endemic birds. Both science and forestry in the last several years have been doing a number of outreach events, and this includes taking youth out birding, teaching them about their local birds and why they're important and why they're valuable. And of course, outreach and education is so vitally important for the long-term conservation of these species and ensuring that they have support from the public, to make sure that protections are in place for these birds and the habitats that they need to survive. And this is Lister Kolzak. She's the director of the NGO Science. And she's a longtime environmental educator doing a fantastic job with programs in the schools, summer camps, Saturday programs, field trips, and so forth. She's got a really great team at Science. Here's just a few pictures of some of the students that she was working with. They're coloring in photos and learning about the Whistling Warbler and the St. Vincent parrot, and taking them out into the field on birding hikes, playing some bird ID games in the field to learn the local birds. And then we are also excited to share that as a result of this project, we worked with Arnaldo Toledo, who's a Cuban artist and illustrator, incredibly talented. And we created new endemic bird coloring pages for folks to use for outreach and education. And then he also painted in versions of these. You know, we can use these to create posters, note cards, postcards, and so forth. They're just really incredibly beautiful, as you can see. And so we're excited to be sharing those with everybody at the workshop next week. All right, so that's it for my part of the show. I'm going to end, and Mike's going to pick up where I left off to talk about the details of the monitoring.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Lisa. I'll share my screen now. Can you see this?
Yes, we can.
Great. Thanks, Lisa, for that introduction. Um, and all that info about the education and the background. So I'll be focusing in on the whistling warbler now and the research that we've been doing with forestry and others on the project. And so the whistling warbler is an IUCN listed endangered species due to its small range. It's only found in St. Vincent um, on the main island, and it has restricted habitat. The habitat has been declining over time, and generally there's relatively little known about this species. Um, and so who is this whistling warbler? Many of the pictures that you've often seen are of the adult male in the bottom right, but you can also come across juveniles, immature birds, or females. And if you do come across these individuals, it'd be great to get more pictures of some of the other age and sex classes, so that we can have a better idea. The female, I believe, is kind of less distinct in coloration compared to the male, a little bit more brown, gray. And then the juveniles seem to kind of be more of a fluffy, kind of grayish, without as distinct black bars and white on the underside. And so you may come across these other individuals that are not males as well. And here's a video. So what does the warbler sound like? You hear that okay?
Yes, that was great.
Great. So
Incredible
yeah,
call.
so that's what you might hear in during a point count or in the forest, that whistling warbler call. They're definitely more likely to hear them than see them. And that's their main song, but you can additionally hear other calls that the whistling warbler does, and more like chip notes. So here are some other calls that. And you can look at those more on eBird in the library if you want to check those out as well. Um, other information about their behavior, they often cock their tail when moving around. Really distinct species that's its own genus. It forages in the understory, midstory, often kind of 2 to 15 meters in height, not at the tops of the trees. And it can be in vine tangles, and likely primarily eats insects and larvae, occasionally potentially fruit, and maybe gleaning insects on vegetation with some fly catching. But overall, there's really not much published information on the whistling warbler. There's just one single published study, and a few kind of unpublished reports on the bird. We don't really know anything about the bird's reproduction, and still this is kind of unknown. In terms of elevation, the bird is generally found above 300 meters, up to about 650 meters, although some past studies have noted potentially up to 1,000 meters on near Richmond if there's suitable habitat available. Also, there's not a great estimate of population size. Rough estimates are maybe between 1,500 to 3,000 individuals, but it's a little bit difficult to get at a precise estimate without further research. The birds are using primary and secondary rainforest, and palm break is what these past studies have found. But as Lisa mentioned, the volcano erupted in 2021. It's important to determine how the whistling warbler and other bird populations are recovering from these disturbance events. Additionally, there was a hurricane that hit St. Vincent in 2024, and it will be useful to see how the birds are responding to that as well. And so there's really a lot more need for further information on this endangered species and other birds on St. Vincent, examining habitat relationships, abundance, reproductive info, effects of invasive mammals, and all this will be useful for conservation planning. So we conducted a research project on the warbler the last few years, determining relationships between presence of the warbler and other variables, examining the effects of the volcano eruption, also building capacity for the Department of Forestry to go out and survey for this bird and other birds, and then creating the conservation action plan for the warbler. So we conducted the fieldwork in May 2022, January, February 23, and March 24, visiting upland forest trails throughout the island. These were areas by the volcano as well as areas farther south not affected by the eruption, and also sites on the leeward and windward side of the island. Um, this is kind of a map. I'll get more into this map of the sites we surveyed a little bit later. But we had 9 initial sites in 2022, additional 4 sites in 23, and resurveyed 2 of the sites, and then 4 additional sites in 2024, and 4 sites were resurveyed. And these were specifically with point counts. There has been um, other people and forestry going out to some of these sites as well to kind of check on if the birds are present as well, and posting their observations on eBird. But for these point counts, our survey methods were following the PROALAS protocol. So this is kind of a good example of using the PROALAS protocol in the Caribbean. We set up survey points mainly on trails, just because of logistics, and it's very hard to survey off trails in St. Vincent due to the terrain. But the points were situated about at least 200 meters apart each point, so that each point had independence for some of the smaller songbirds. And we generally wanted to set up points within homogeneous or the same kind of vegetation habitat. We don't want to point on the edge of two habitat types because then we can't match up the birds with a given habitat type. So we generally have the point at least 30 meters, ideally away from kind of a habitat edge. And so some of the habitats down in St. Vincent that, and many of the local partners know these very well. So here's the primary rainforest in the top right, really kind of dense, closed canopy, lots of vegetation structure. We also had some surveys in kind of older secondary forests with many large trees, but also some potentially shorter trees, some potentially anthropogenic trees as well. More surveys were also in younger secondary forests. So this is secondary forest, but has more open canopy, very few large trees. This is really near the volcano, just forest that has regrown even in just a few years. This picture was taken in 2022, and the forests near Trinity and the forest had regrown quite a bit, even just in a single year, but was quite open in terms of canopy and young vegetation. We also did some surveys in tree plantations. So these are planted forests, often with non-native trees. This includes blue maho or hibiscus. There's also some cypress and Caribbean pine plantations. And we did some surveys and mahogany trees as well. We did some surveys in the tree plantations. Palm break is another habitat type at higher elevations. As you go up the trails on the volcano, as well as even higher elevation, you get into elfin woods, which is very short, 1 meter, 2 meter vegetation, dominated by heliconias and other ground vegetation. And so in all these habitats, we conducted these 10-minute PROALAS point counts. So following the protocol, which I'll get into, we did about 2 to 8 points per site or trail. And then we visited the sites and points multiple times to examine kind of detectability of the birds. We conducted also 5-minute counts just for the whistling warblers. All counts were done up until around noon, generally not in heavy rain or wind, and all of our data entered up on eBird as well. And so for the PROALAS counts, we record all birds heard or seen as a general PROALAS passive point count. And we recorded if the bird, we used a two-band protocol if the bird was within 30 meters or outside of 30 meters from the point. We also kind of set aside any flyover birds that are flying over but not actually using the vegetation in the point. So those were our PROALAS counts. We also conducted 5-minute whistling warbler counts specifically for the warbler, where we played the warbler song and calls for the first 2 minutes. And then we had a passive count just looking for the bird or hearing the bird without playback after for 3 minutes. Our playback surveys were always done after our regular PROALAS counts, and we generally just did playback surveys once per season. So we're not getting the birds used to that call and just using as just another method to bring the birds in and get and detect the species. We recorded some other info on the birds, such as height above ground, behavior, age, and sex. We generally think the warblers could be heard about 100, 150 meters away when they were singing, but it might depend on the habitat too. We did also set out audio recorders at 25 points over the 3 years. These are actually different locations that some of the parrot group, the collaborators, have been setting out this past year. But these audio recorders were set out mostly at the same locations where we were doing the PROALAS point counts. We set the recorders to record in the morning and then have some recording as well for amphibians if any collaborators want to use that data for evening recordings where we heard amphibians. Um, we haven't fully kind of examined the ARU data either from the parrot group recordings or from these recordings. And so there won't be results kind of presented from that today. Besides kind of doing these point counts for any kind of PROALAS protocol, it's often really useful to record some sort of vegetation or habitat at your survey points. So this is useful for statistical analyses and trying to match up where the birds are present with the habitat and vegetation on the ground. And so we recorded a bunch of different we recorded a number of variables at each point location. This included if the point was impacted by the volcano or not. The red area up here was really an area in the north that got really impacted by the volcano eruption. We also looked at leeward versus windward side of the island, elevation, the habitat vegetation types that I mentioned earlier. We also recorded some other vegetation metrics like canopy height, canopy cover, understory cover, doing this with visual percentages. And then we also recorded basal area, which is kind of how many trees, how large the trees are around the point. The presence of moss or absence of moss can indicate how wet the habitat is, and that was a good indicator that we'll talk about in a bit. We did record a few other things like heliconias or a few other um, a few other aspects, but they weren't included or that useful in our analyses. We did also record other survey info, such as things that could impact detection of the birds, the time of day, wind and sky conditions, if there were river noise, the type of survey that we're doing, and as well as the number of observers. So all of these things we can look at to see if that affects the detection probability in our analyses. And then what we did is we conducted standard occupancy models, they're called, which incorporate if you can detect a bird during the survey or not. We also used the standard model selection approach and AIC approach to compare among different variables and predictors we were looking at. As usual, as standard in these types of analyses, if there were correlated predictor variables, they weren't included in the same model. We did examine the data both using the unlimited radius of point counts. So if the bird is heard 100, 200 meters away versus just using the data within 30 meters, we generally got similar results from those two different data sets or ways to analyze the data. And so there wasn't that big of a difference. When I was looking at habitat type, because we were interested in the habitat specifically right around the point location within a 30-meter radius, and that was the habitat we were recording. We looked at that variable specifically within 30-meter radius, and if we were picking up birds within that 30-meter radius count. So hopefully I'm not going too fast, but here I'll show some photos in the field. This was our first kind of pilot season in 2022. Here, Mr. Glenroy Games helped out extensively with the project as well as others throughout in forestry. And we covered lots of ground, different sites in a fairly limited amount of time. This is Antioch student Christian Carson that came down to the island in 2024 with me, crossing a river on the leeward side near the volcano on the island. And here's Kishbert and Christian up near the fairly close to the top of the volcano on the leeward side. We went to lots of other sites as well. Here's Caswin and Glenroy, and then here is a picture of me on the windward side of the volcano. And had lots of other people helping out throughout the time, kind of driving on all of these roads to get to the sites, and even through some rivers on on some days. And also collaborating with the Parrot group as well, Dr. Christina Gomez and others, to explore some of the sites throughout the island. And Jeff from Cornell as well. So our results in 2020, for or across the 3 years, we covered 94 locations, point locations, conducted over 200 10-minute PROALAS counts and over 100 5-minute counts specifically for the warbler. And the warbler was detected really only at 24% of the points, so a fairly small number of the points. And even if you just consider where the bird was within the 30-meter radius of the counts, only 14% of the points had a bird within the 30-meter radius of each location. And so here's a map. This map, so I'll walk you through some of this. I have a next slide that also has another map. This map has kind of everything on it. On the left-hand side, all of the different sites that we covered, including, sorry if the text is too small, but including La Soufriere Trail on the leeward side and the windward side, Mahorn Ridge, a few points in Trinity, but that trail is not accessible currently. Darkview Falls and Montcasson, Perseverance and Jennings, Lindley Valley, Hermitage, Coffee and Youngman's Valley, Vermont area, Fenton Falls, Majorca, Montreal and Tiburon, and Silver Spoon and 5 Acres. And some of these were covered just once over the course of 3 years. Others were covered multiple times. This map also includes past sightings that are listed on eBird, as well as kind of other eBird sightings before and after the volcano eruption. Some of these locations are slightly incorrect. Like there's some eBird locations that start at a parking lot, and then the person walked a few miles or a few kilometers. So the bird is not actually present at the parking lot. The bird is present farther up. And so these maps are okay, but some of the eBird locations may be slightly incorrect and do need some revision. We also have a map that we created just for the PROALAS counts. And so this is a little bit more informative, and you can really hone in on where we're seeing the birds with these standardized point counts. We really don't have too many birds in Mahorn Ridge, but there's one right at the end of the trail, right at in the palm break at the highest elevation. Along the windward side, the birds are kind of along the La Soufriere Trail in the mid elevation. And there's really only a few good spots that we know of that there are warblers present, and that includes the Windward Side Trail, Silver Spoon, Montreal and Tiburon area, Majorca, Fenton Falls, and also in Vermont. There's occasionally been some birds in Coffee, Lindley Valley, and Perseverance and Hermitage. So we have had some birds in there, but definitely the key hotspots are Silver Spoon, Majorca. There was a number of birds, Tiburon, and the Windward La Soufriere Trail. And I'll get into that in a little bit later, but definitely the abundance is and occurrence is fairly localized. If a bird was present, we generally saw just a single bird. Territories were fairly spaced out. Just 2% of the surveys had 2 to 3 warblers at a point. Accounting for detection, about 28%, we estimate 28% of the points had birds based on the model output. And we can also, with the analyses, try to determine how well we are at detecting the species. And we suspect with unlimited distance counts that we're generally detecting the bird 59% of the time if the bird is there. So if we do multiple surveys at a given point where we are likely to actually detect that individual bird, because most times we should be detecting that species about 60% of the time for the warbler. We did test a number of different variables and how that they influence detection probability, but actually none of these really seem to influence the warbler. If the warbler was there and singing, it didn't really it didn't depend on how many observers we had or the type of survey we did. We would still kind of hear the bird about 60% of the time if it was there. And so these variables were not included in further analyses. I then did a number of other analyses really looking at what impacts the occupancy or the presence of the birds, and found that there was really 3 variables that were really driving where the bird was found. That included if the bird was in wet forest and there was moss present on the trees, if the point was on the windward side of the island, the eastern side had much more warblers than the leeward side of the island. And there was also some effect of elevation, a quadratic effect of elevation. The warblers were not really impacted by the volcano eruption, at least on the windward side. And they still seem to be in areas on the La Soufrière Trail and Mohorn Ridge, even where vegetation was destroyed in 2021 and is regrowing. That's slightly different on the leeward side. The leeward side did get really hit hard by the volcano. This is at kind of the top of the leeward side trail. And the vegetation is extremely short and not much forest on that side of the island. Generally, there's fewer birds in general on the leeward side for the warblers, and there's not much overall vegetation left after the volcano eruption on the leeward side. So there are definitely not much habitat and no birds present over there. These are just some figures from the analyses, the model output, just kind of what I talked about. So where on the y-axis you have the probability of occurrence, and the x-axis you have the predictor variables, what's impacting the birds for the warblers. And as you can see, the highest probability of occurrence is on the windward side of the island in wet forests with moss. And the lowest probability of occurrence is on the leeward side, even in forests, but those that are drier and without moss. In terms of elevation, here's some graphs that show those different categories, windward side, as well as moss or not moss, but also looking at elevation. And as you can see, there's fewer birds, there's fewer probability of occurrence or lower probability of occurrence as you get kind of less than 300 meters in elevation. The birds tend to drop off. And then as you get above 600 or 700 meters, there are fewer warblers present. So they really seem to be honing in on these mid-elevation forests that have kind of primary rainforest. And that gets into kind of this figure looking at the effects of habitat type or vegetation type. We had quite high or higher probability of occurrence for warblers in the primary forest and palm break, although we didn't have a ton of points in palm break, but there's at least some warblers that we found in palm break. Um, Secondary forest has slightly lower occurrence or presence of warblers. And then the lowest probability of occurrence for warblers was in tree plantations, like blue maho tree plantations. And we also had no warblers in elfin woods high up on the volcano. Um, and so overall, just gonna try to, I'm getting close with time, but try to kind of go over some more broad aspects. In terms of the bird's range, there is this kind of dark green polygon here that shows their range as estimated by a study in 1976, as well as the current BirdLife International map. But generally, there's been few surveys in the interior of the island just due to logistics and getting into the interior. And we didn't really find many birds on the leeward side of the island. And so this this range map can definitely be improved and may be quite out of date after the volcano eruption. The occurrence really varies locally, and so they're really in wetter forests. And so areas that don't have as wet forests, you just won't find birds. So they're definitely not present throughout this entire area. And determining their range would really be useful to then determine their population size. But trying to get a better idea, maybe with GIS and with spatial analyses, to try to figure out, okay, what is suitable habitat for the bird? What is wet forests with lots of structure? And then where are the birds most abundant? And trying to figure out then their population size. But currently, it can be difficult to really determine. Are there 1,000 birds on the island, or are there 3 to 4,000? And it's just tough to say at this point. Other things to highlight, we still don't know much about their reproduction. There have been lots of juveniles and immature birds seen pretty much throughout the whole year. But it's a little bit difficult to know because the juveniles might not obtain their adult plumage. Like other Caribbean species, they might not obtain their adult plumage immediately. Um, we did find that males really do sing more in May during our surveys compared to over the winter. And other studies have found that they may breed in the spring and or in the summer. So if you're out in the field and can try to find some nests or fledglings, that would be great. But we still really don't know exactly when these birds are breeding or if they're breeding different times of the year. We also really don't know much still about their nests. We did do some nest searching, but we're kind of unsuccessful. Mr. Games has previously found 2 nests that he thought were warbler nests, being kind of domed and closed nests. But it's possible we also observed similar nests as in this picture here, um, never active with a female. Um, but it's possible that bullfinches also build these types of nests. Bananaquit nests are slightly different, but bullfinches potentially could be building this type of nest. Um, Really old studies about 100 years ago noted that warblers might be using a cup-shaped nest that local forestry officers had found on the island 100 years ago. And these nests might be more similar to other warbler species, but we still don't really know what their nest looks like and have kind of scientific documentation of that, and that's definitely needed still. So to just summarize, more warblers were found on the windward side in wetter habitats at those elevations, mid elevations. And we really had fewer warblers in the tree plantations. As you can see from these pictures, the tree plantations had a lot less vegetation structure, not as much mid-story. Um, and so there just might not be as much food or resources for the birds in these blue mahoe plantations compared to primary forest or even secondary forest. Um, so for the conservation and the conservation action plan, really, I do recommend to conserve these wetter montane forests, limit development and illegal agriculture, limit any kind of additional roads that might bring additional development into the forest, such as a northern cross island road, as well as when conducting restoration in some of these reclaimed pasture agricultural areas, planting native trees if possible, and allowing the natural forest and the native species to regrow. In terms of further work, there definitely could be further point counts um, in other areas throughout Island, depending on the accessibility. Some of these areas might not really be very accessible. There could be further studies just looking, resurveying the existing points, especially after the hurricane last year. And further collaborating with others and using ARUs to document where the warblers and other birds are. Further work on nest searching and monitoring would be useful, as well as potentially collaborating with others to get at better estimates of land cover and habitat suitability analysis for the warbler using GIS throughout the island, which will then help get at their range and population size. Here's Dradelia and Saki helping out with some surveys. And then future work, we have the upcoming Conservation Action Plan workshop, writing up the Conservation Action Plan and implementing it in the field. And then, as Lisa mentioned, increasing education and outreach as well, and continuing to build forestry and others' capacity to monitor and conserve this species and other species on the island. So I want to thank everybody for this project wouldn't be possible without all of these collaborators, especially the forestry department on St. Vincent, as well as our funders, the UNDP and CEPF, Antioch University as well, where I work, and additional collaborators, Birds Caribbean, Florida International University, Cornell, Science on St. Vincent, and GEF. Thanks, everybody. I'm happy to take questions if there's any time left.
Sure, Mike. If people need to jump off, they can jump off, but I think we could definitely spend a few minutes answering questions for those that can stay on. Maya, did you gather questions?
Yes. So we have a few questions in the Q&A. Andy asked, were there any migratory birds in this study? And if so, was their survival rate any different from the endemic species?
Do you want me to answer the questions, Lisa? Or
Go for it. I'll jump in if I have anything to add.
okay. So St. Vincent generally doesn't have too many migratory birds that come down that far south to the island. I believe there's some in the fall, potentially during migration, and some shorebirds. But for passerines, there's not too many migratory birds. And we also didn't really look at survival. We were looking at kind of just if presence or absence of the bird. We didn't specifically look at the survival of the birds, but yeah, some of the other Lesser Antillean islands or islands farther north in the Caribbean definitely get more migratory songbirds, but they just don't come down that far south.
Sternly asked, what family does the warbler belong to? Maybe this can provide some information to know more about this bird.
That is a good question. Lisa, do you know off the top of your head?
I would have to look it up. I don't know.
It does look like it's in Parulidae, which is generally warblers, but the genus is unique. I believe it's just a unique genus that there aren't many other, or it's really the only member of its genus. Yeah.
Yeah. Jim asked, did playback of vocalizations enhance detectability significantly?
So we actually looked at that in the model and it didn't. That was surprising, but generally the birds, if they will sing every so often, like even once, even in the February and March, they'll sing once every 10 minutes. So even if they're not singing that much, you still will pick them up with the PROALAS counts. Um, and occasionally we would get a bird come in to the playback that we didn't see or hear in the first 10-minute count, but usually we heard it as well just in the 10-minute count.
Thank you. And Felipe asked, do you have a first estimation of the population?
I had included something in my report, but I would like to do more. I think we really need to do more GIS analyses and suitability analyses because we don't really have a great idea of the range of the species. I can give an estimate for density based on the counts that we do have and say, okay, there's X number of birds per point, but we don't know what to multiply that by the whole area that the bird is actually using or not.
So down the line, hopefully we'll have more information. And there was actually one other question in the chat from Alcides, who asked, did you make transects or plots for the vegetation surveys and what were the measurements?
We did a lot of the vegetation surveys were visually done. So we did within 30-meter radius of the points, we created 4 quadrats. So we split up the circle into 4, and we said, okay, in the north east quadrant, what's the percentage of vegetation? How high is the canopy? Um, how much canopy cover there is? And we did that in all 4 quadrats: north, east, east, south, southwest, west, north, and then we averaged those together. So we didn't have specific it was very difficult to get off trail to do any kind of actual other types of vegetation surveys. So we were just at the point location doing kind of visual surveys, as well as what's called a basal area swing or a prism, looking at the basal area, which is kind of a forestry metric to look at tree size and the number of trees at the location.
Awesome. And just a follow-up to that, Alcides asked, were there some key plant species found in the vegetation surveys?
Um, we were originally thinking that the warbler might be in areas with heliconias, but heliconias were at like 80–90% of the point locations, so it was kind of throughout the island. Macgravia was a genus that may also be associated with a warbler, but generally just kind of wetter forests that had more moss on the trees was where we were picking them up. So, yeah.
Any last minute questions for Mike or Lisa?
Yeah, I think the good news is we're going to continue the monitoring, and there's lots more data analysis to be done, including with more GIS work to figure out the habitat associations of the warbler with specific habitat types. So yeah, field work is continuing. We still haven't analyzed like the audio moth recordings, which Mike and the team have gathered, and also collaborating with FIU. They put out a lot of audio moths for the St. Vincent parrot. Yeah, we hope you'll tune in tomorrow to learn more about what they're finding out from passive acoustic monitoring. But we hope their recorders will also, at least in some areas, pick up the warbler. So we'll be able to get more data from that. And we've got the forestry staff and folks that are going to continue the monitoring this next year. So we hope to gather a lot more PROALAS data as well for Mike to model and hopefully eventually figure out, habitat better understanding of habitat use and also abundance, maybe get an estimate of population size.
There were a couple last minute questions in the Q&A. You go ahead? Okay.
Sure.
So other than habitat loss / quality, are there any other threats of interest? Oh boy.
Uh, um, For the warbler, it's fairly straightforward. It is definitely possible that the invasive mammals like black rats or mongoose are getting at the nests, but we have and others have seen fledglings and juveniles, so they do seem to be at least reproducing in some regard. Um, and so that is a possibility. We don't really know anything about their reproduction, and that could be something that's making the population decline. Climate change is certainly an issue with increased hurricanes impacting the island and if destroying kind of forest. The the island is a pretty large island compared to other islands in the Caribbean. So, but if there is a direct hit of a hurricane on St. Vincent, that could be problematic. And then in terms of climate change, just further drought in the Caribbean might really impact these wetter forests where this warbler is located. Um, and then, yeah, habitat loss and quality is kind of a big thing as well. Lisa, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, there's just a lot of agriculture encroaching in these forest areas, growing taro and ginger and fruit trees and marijuana. And so, that's a big factor, and other, like Mike said, building roads, towns, villages can also impact these areas. So, you do have human development threats. And then when you put on top of that, things like the hurricanes and volcanoes and climate change, then it really causes a problem for the warbler and also the St. Vincent parrot, that habitat loss. They can't recover as easily when they don't have a lot of high quality habitat remaining.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, one last question in the Q&A. And I don't know that we can actually answer this one yet. This will probably be discussed in the workshop next week. How much does the warbler and parrot overlap in sightings and sound?
So yeah, there are definitely areas where there are both parrots and warblers, and you'll see them, but there's definitely other sites where you might find parrots and no warblers, or sites where you'll find warblers and no parrots. So the sounds definitely differ from each other, but or their calls, but yeah, there's definitely areas. Jennings is a really great area for parrots, and there's not really warblers present there that we've picked up. And then there's other sites where there might be more warblers, um, potentially like in Fenton Falls, and potentially not as many parrots. But I guess often um, if there are warblers, there might also be parrots, but we'd have to check the data on that and look at it a little bit closer. Um, yeah, something to work more with the parrot folks and thinking about keystone species too. Like, does the warbler or the parrot kind of encompass or be an umbrella species for many other forest birds or not, is something to potentially to look into as well. Um, and there's lots of other forest birds like the trembler and the euphonia and the solitaire that are important on the island. Um, And just a few other, there were some things in the chat. We generally tried not to have too many points along on edges. There were some points on edge habitat, and I looked at that in a slightly separate model, and I still didn't really find an effect of edge habitat. Generally, there are certain species like tanagers that really like kind of edge habitats near agricultural areas and interior forests, but for the warblers, they really do seem to be more in the interior of the forest, and not kind of right on the edges or with scattered trees in agricultural areas. Um, And then in terms of taking pictures of the bird, ideally not using too much playback because that could affect the monitoring. But there are certain sites where Mr. Games, Glenroy, or others may take people out and use recordings and then bring in at least the male to take photos of them. But also if you're just out in the forest and can get pictures of the females or the juveniles, that would be really beneficial as well.
And look for nests. We
Yeah.
need to find a confirmed nest of the warbler. Thanks, Stefan. Yeah, thanks everybody for joining. And I did put a link to register for the St. Vincent Amazon webinar tomorrow. It promises to be really exciting. So do sign up and join us for that webinar, and you'll hear all about the audio recording, the passive acoustic monitoring of the St. Vincent Amazon. Okay, and wrap it up.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining. And as always, I'd like to thank Efren for helping with interpretation. Thank you so much, Efren. And yes, please join us tomorrow for the webinar on the St. Vincent Amazon.